In the early 1970s, Freddie Mercury kept returning to Tate Gallery in London to study a tiny, overcrowded painting by Richard Dadd. He urged the rest of Queen to look at it too, not as decoration, but as a world that had to be read, figure by figure, creature by creature, corner by corner. Then he went home and wrote a song about it. Not about a fairy tale, about the man who made it. A man who had taken a knife and a razor to his own father during an evening walk in a park in August of 1843, and who, more than a decade later, inside the criminal wing of Bethlem Royal Hospital, began the small canvas that would consume 9 years of his life. Look at this painting for the first time, and it seems almost charming. A dense forest floor crowded with fairy tale creatures, a stocky woodsman raising his axe over a hazelnut. Victorian whimsy, Shakespeare meets nature. But stay with it a moment longer, and something shifts. The longer you look, the less charming it becomes. The air feels wrong. The space feels wrong. There is no sky, no horizon, no depth. The whole composition collapses flat against you, like a wall pressing in. That is not an accident. Let's start with what everyone sees first: the feller himself, frozen at the exact peak of his swing. Around him, dozens of fairy creatures have gathered to watch. The whole scene is waiting for him to strike. And here is the first thing that doesn't fit. He never does. The axe has been suspended at the moment of impact for 160 years. The crowd has been waiting, paralyzed, for 160 years. No other Victorian fairy painting does this. Artists like Joseph Noel Paton or Daniel Maclise painted fairies in motion, dancing, floating, dissolving into moonlight. Dadd painted a massacre, frozen mid-breath. The Nobel Prize-winning poet Octavio Paz, who wrote an extended essay on this canvas, described the sensation as terrifying anticipation. The entire composition radiates the feeling of the second before catastrophe. Not magic, not wonder, pure dread. Now look closer. At the front of the painting, thick stalks of timothy grass cut across the foreground in a dense horizontal band. Most people see them as botanical detail, careful Victorian naturalism. But trace their arrangement, the way they overlap, the way they bar access to the scene behind them. They function exactly like prison bars. Dadd painted this canvas inside a locked cell. He had no freedom of movement, almost no control over the world outside the canvas. The grass is the cell. We are on the outside looking in, and he is on the inside looking out. The painting is only 54 centimeters tall by 39 centimeters wide, smaller than a laptop screen. Dadd worked on this surface for 9 years, from 1855 to 1864, and packed it with what appears to be hundreds of individual figures, each rendered with a detail that approaches the botanical. The surface feels less painted than built. Writers and conservators often describe his method as microscopic and layered, creating an almost three-dimensional effect. The impasto so thick in places that objects appear to physically protrude from the canvas. But the deeper technical question, whether he worked from a complete scheme held entirely in memory, or whether he had access to preliminary drawings or a related version, remains more complicated than the legend suggests. What we can say with certainty is that the result looks like no other Victorian painting. It resembles a carved relief more than a painted surface, and the process that produced it was unlike anything his contemporaries attempted. The Victorian era was in the grip of microscopy fever. Darwin had just published. Scientists were classifying every beetle and leaf vein with obsessive precision. Dad absorbed that spirit and bent it entirely inward and backward, towards something the microscope could not reach. Here is the second thing that doesn't fit. Look at the small figure tucked into the upper right corner of the painting. He is crouched over a mortar and pestle, grinding something with focused concentration. He is the only figure in the scene who is not watching the feller. He is turned slightly away, as if he wants no part of what is about to happen. Tate curators, including Francis Fowle, have documented what this figure is likely meant to represent. Dad's father, Robert Dad, who was a chemist by profession. The pestle, held in a grip that echoes a knife, is, in their reading, a direct reference to the profession of the man his son attacked. Robert Dad is painted into this fairy court, miniaturized, cornered, holding the instrument of his trade. And he is oblivious. He is the only one who doesn't see the axe rising. This is placed where the eye could pass over it for decades, and most people's eyes have. But the warden, let me be precise here, because precision matters. Hayden was not a warden in the prison sense. George Henry Hayden was the steward of Bethlem, part administrator, part patron, part keeper of the world in which Dad was now trapped. He was also a writer, a traveler who had published accounts of Australia, and a contributor to the satirical journal Punch. He gave Dad materials. He commissioned the painting for his own private residence, which sat directly on the grounds of the asylum. Dad spent 9 years making a gift for the man who held the administrative keys to his existence. And inside that gift, he buried everything Hayden could never be allowed to understand. Because here is the third layer. Look at the large, commanding figure at the center of the composition. An old man in white robes, crowned with what is unmistakably a triple tiara. His right hand is raised in a gesture of authority, commanding the scene to hold still. Art historians identify this figure as representing the Pope, which is not a decorative choice. In 1843, while traveling through Rome with his patron Sir Thomas Phillips, Dad became convinced that the Egyptian god of the dead, Osiris, was speaking to him directly. Osiris had given him a mission: to eliminate the devil's representatives on earth. Dad wanted to confront the Pope. He was restrained only because the papal guard was too strong. He left Rome and turned toward his father instead. So in this painting, made for Hayden, displayed in a household, presented as innocent fairy art rooted in Shakespeare, Dad placed the Pope as a powerless spectator in a pagan ritual presided over by an axe. The patriarch cannot stop the stroke. He can only watch. In Victorian England, this was not whimsy. This was heresy of a very particular kind, encoded inside an illustration, hanging on the wall of a man who had no idea. And now the title itself. In 19th century English slang, feller, spelled exactly as Dad spells it, was a common mispronunciation of fellow, meaning a man, a person. But it also derived from the verb to fell, to bring something down with a lethal blow. The fairy feller is not only a woodsman, he is the one who strikes. Dad also drew attention in his own explanatory poem to another rhyme embedded in the title. He had attributed the onset of his collapse during his journey down the Nile in 1842 to what he called a sunstroke and sunstroke and sunstroke are phonetically identical. The masterstroke that names this painting may be in the logic of a mind that had reorganized around one terrible event, the act that divided his life into before Bethlem and after. Dad wrote a long, rhymed catalog to accompany the painting. Hundreds of lines in which he attempted to name and justify nearly every creature in the composition. He worked through them obsessively, describing the scene in meticulous verse. And then, at the end, he added this: "For not as nothing it explains, and nothing from nothing, nothing gains." Having written hundreds of lines to explain the painting, he closed by saying the poem explains nothing. He sealed the confession inside a riddle and handed it to Haydn with a bow. I want to pause here and say something directly. I cannot know what Dad intended. No one can. His doctor, William Charles Hood, left no clinical records that would settle the question of whether Dad was conscious of what he was encoding, or whether the symbols arrived through him without his full awareness. The psychoanalytic reading, developed by scholars like Adam Roberts and Nicholas Tromans, argues that the painting is a displaced confession, that the axe raised over the nut is a repetition of the act in Cobham Park. The more literal interpretation, associated with David Graysmith and others, holds that the painting is precisely what it claims to be: a fiercely detailed illustration of an old nursery rhyme and a Shakespeare monologue, executed with the accumulated obsession of a trained Royal Academy painter working under delusion and confinement. One thing I find hard to dismiss is this: Dad was not a naive artist. Before his illness, he was a professional of some reputation, trained at the Royal Academy, capable of producing accomplished conventional work. He knew what a mortar and pestle held like a knife looks like. He knew that a triple crown over an old man in white robes reads as papal authority. He had 9 years alone to decide exactly where every element would go. When a craftsman of that caliber makes those choices over that span of time, I find it difficult to call them unconscious. But that may be my reading, not his intention. That gap between what we see and what he meant is exactly where the painting lives. The bottom left corner of the canvas is unfinished. It remains a rough, brownish sketch where the rest of the surface has been worked to obsessive precision. For a long time, the story told about this was simple. In July of 1864, Dad was transferred from Bethlem to Broadmoor, the newly opened maximum security criminal asylum in Berkshire, and he was taken from his cell without the chance to complete the work. The unfinished corner was an interruption, not a decision. But more recent scholarship, including Kim Forrester's research, has asked whether the incompleteness might have been deliberate, whether the refusal to finish was itself part of the meaning. The unfinished corner is the wound in the painting where biography breaks into interpretation. Perhaps Dad simply ran out of time. Perhaps the blankness was chosen. Either way, it is not empty. It is where the painting stops explaining itself. What we know for certain is this: Dad never returned to the canvas. He was transferred to Broadmoor, where he would spend the remaining 22 years of his life. He did eventually reconstruct the painting from memory, producing a watercolor version called Songe de la Fantaisie, now held at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. The two compositions are strikingly close. Whatever map he carried in his head, it held. For almost a century, the painting did what trauma often does. It disappeared into private rooms. It passed from Haydn to Alfred Morrison, a wealthy collector, and then into the orbit of Siegfried Sassoon, a war poet who understood, from personal experience, what a damaged mind could carry. Sassoon had been treated for severe shell shock at Craig-Lockhart War Hospital during the First World War. He had spent years afterward trying to locate what the war had done to him and whether language could hold it. A painting created inside one broken life was preserved for decades by a man whose own life had been broken by different violence. When Sassoon nearly sold the painting at auction through Sotheby's in 1963, he stopped himself. Afraid that it would vanish into the market, into private hands that would lock it away again, he withdrew it from the sale at the last moment and gave it to the nation instead. It has hung at Tate Britain, catalog number T00598, ever since. The reception it produced was not neutral. When the counterculture magazine Oz published a reproduction in the late 1960s, the painting became a kind of underground icon. Dad reread as a victim of Victorian psychiatric control, the painting as proof of what a suppressed mind could build in chains. Mercury's obsession was personal and real. He felt the density of the canvas mirrored something about the way certain kinds of attention work, accumulating and accumulating with no release valve, no exit, no resolution. When he composed the Queen track of the same name for the 1974 album Queen 2, he structured it as a series of character introductions, naming the figures from the painting one by one. Then he cut the song off abruptly, unresolved, without a cadence. The song doesn't end, it stops, just like the axe. Forrester's dissertation, completed in 2025, argues something more radical still. She contends that the composition follows the iconographic logic of a medieval Last Judgment, that Dad, working from the vocabulary of religious art he had absorbed before his illness, built a personal tribunal. The patriarch as pope sits in judgment. The assembled fairy court represents the range of human types and stations. The feller at the center is not a craftsman cracking a nut. He is the act of reckoning itself. If Forrester is right, this is not a fairy illustration, and not simply a displaced confession. It is a court of law, convened inside a painting, inside an asylum, for an audience of one. Dad as judge, as accused, as executioner. We will not get a verdict. The poem is sealed. The records are incomplete. The painting holds its silence in the way that certain objects do, by being simultaneously too much to read and impossible to look away from. There is one last figure I want to draw your attention to. Somewhere in the dense undergrowth at the edge of the composition, half hidden by blades of grass, a small face looks directly out of the painting. Not at the feller, not at the axe, at you. Writers, including Alan Moore, have suggested this peering figure is Dad himself, the artist imprisoned inside his own work, watching the world outside through bars he painted himself, wondering whether anyone will ever see past the fairy tale to the man who put it there. Queen Mab, the fairy queen for whom the whole court has assembled, for whose carriage the hazelnut must be split, she is almost impossible to find. She is the official subject of the scene. She is its stated purpose, but she has dissolved into the background, microscopic, irrelevant. All the attention in the universe of this painting flows toward one figure and one moment, the man with the axe, the stroke that never lands. Can art hold a guilt that the mind cannot exhaust? Or does the act simply live inside the paint forever, repeating itself, waiting for a blow that never arrives? The answer is on the wall at Tate Britain. It has been there for 60 years. The axe is still raised. The crowd is still watching. The apothecary in his corner still hasn't looked up.